but I want to welcome everyone to the Budget Committee. Today's hearing will focus on the federal government's response to the economic crisis. We'll examine the effectiveness of the federal response and what lessons have been learned. Our witnesses are Dr. Alan Blinder, Professor of Economics and Public Affairs at Princeton, and the founder and co-director of the Center for Economic Policy Studies. Welcome, Dr. Blinder. Dr. Mark Zandi, the chief economist at Moody's Analytics, a good friend. Welcome. Good to have you here. Has been to North Dakota at my invitation. Dr. John Taylor, Professor of Economics at Stanford, a Senior Fellow in Economics at the Hoover Institution, and we're delighted that you're here as well, sir. I'm a proud graduate of Stanford myself. This is a really distinguished panel. I don't think we could have done better in terms of having a diversity of views, and we welcome you all and your testimony. I'd like to begin by highlighting the two challenges confronting our nation, the near-term economic weakness and the longer-term budget crunch, and the need to get to focusing like a laser on a long-term debt. In considering the near-term challenge, it's important to remember the crisis we faced just 2 years ago. By mid to late 2008, we were in the midst of the worst recession since the Great Depression. The economy contracted 6.8% in the fourth quarter of 2008. Unemployment was surging, with 800,000 private sector jobs lost in January of 2009 alone. A housing market crisis was rippling through the economy, with home building and home sales plummeting and record foreclosures. Much of that still remains with us. And we faced a financial market crisis that threatened to set off a global economic collapse. Credit markets and lending were largely frozen. We've come a long way since then. The federal response to the crisis, I believe, has successfully pulled the economy back from the brink. And this year, we've begun to see a return to economic and job growth, although much weaker than I think all of us would like to see. The key elements of the federal response included actions by the Federal Reserve, efforts to stabilize the financial sector started with the Bush administration and continued in the Obama administration, and then we had last year's economic recovery package as well. Two of our witnesses, Dr. Blinder and Dr. Zandi, have completed a study that measures the impact of that federal response. To quote their report, they say, quote, "We find that its effects on real GDP, jobs, and inflation are huge and probably averted what would have been called Great Depression 2.0. When all is said and done, the financial and fiscal policies will have cost taxpayers a substantial sum, but not nearly as much as most had feared, and not nearly as much as if policymakers had not acted at all. If the comprehensive policy responses saved the economy from another depression, as we estimate, they were well worth their cost." The next slide compares the economic growth we've actually experienced recently with an estimate of the economic growth we would have experienced without the federal response. I would note that the estimates of economic growth without the federal response have been updated by Budget Committee staff to reflect revisions in the actual economic growth that were released after Dr. Blinder and Dr. Zandi submitted their report. As you can see depicted in the yellow bars, actual economic growth in the fourth quarter of 2008 was a negative 6.8%. By the last quarter of 2009, economic growth had improved to a positive 5%. Growth has continued but has slowed, falling to 1.6% in the second quarter. In contrast, as you can see in the red bars, without the federal response, the economy would have contracted far more sharply, as much as 10.1% in the first quarter of 2009, and we would never have returned to positive economic growth during this time period. The next slide shows the job picture following a similar trajectory. The green line on this chart depicts the actual number of jobs in our economy. We can see that in the first 2 quarters of 2010, the number of jobs has begun to increase again. The red line shows Dr. Blinder and Dr. Zandi's estimate of the number of jobs we would have had without the federal response. According to their findings, we would have had 8.1 million fewer jobs in the second quarter of 2010 if we had not had the federal response. We see a similar picture in the unemployment rate. The green line on this chart shows the actual unemployment rate on a quarterly basis, now hovering about 9.7%. Still far too high. Got to do more to create jobs, bring this rate down. But according to Dr. Blinder and Dr. Zandi, if we had not had the federal response, the unemployment rate would now be 15% and would continue rising to 16.2% by the fourth quarter of 2010. So clearly, the federal response to the economic crisis has had and continues to have a significant positive effect. But we are clearly not out of the woods yet. The economy remains unsteady and faces strong headwinds. That's why in the near term, probably the next 18 to 24 months, I believe we need to focus on providing additional liquidity to boost demand, but we can't afford to repeat the mistake of the mid-1930s when recovery measures were curtailed too quickly and the Depression was prolonged. Now let me be clear. That does not mean that we should be ignoring the looming budget crisis, because the debt long-term is the threat, and it must be confronted, and it must be dealt with. The retirement of the baby boom generation, rising health care costs, our outdated and inefficient and non-competitive tax system needs to be changed. We need to face up to exploding deficits and debt. According to CBO, federal debt could rise to almost 400% of GDP by 2054. Of course, that would be 40 years from now. That is a completely unsustainable course. What we should be doing now is putting in place deficit reduction policies that will kick in after the economy is more fully recovered, but very soon. And by establishing and enacting those policies now, we will reassure financial markets that the United States is confronting its long-term fiscal imbalances. This is what Federal Chairman Bernanke said earlier this year about the need for a credible plan to address the long-term fiscal imbalance. And I quote, "A sharp near-term reduction in our fiscal deficit is probably neither practical nor advisable. However, nothing prevents us from beginning now to develop a credible plan for meeting our long-term fiscal challenges. Indeed, a credible plan that demonstrated a commitment to achieving long-term fiscal sustainability could lead to lower interest rates and more rapid growth in the near term." I completely agree. That's why the work of the President's Fiscal Commission is important. As a member of that commission, I can attest to the serious work that is being done there. Senator Gregg, of course, serves on that commission as well. I remain hopeful that we will come up with a serious and credible plan to face up to our long-term deficits and debt. The steps that must be taken will not be easy, but they will pay significant dividends for this country.